In just 36 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved morning television hosts completely lost control on live television, turning what should have been a lighthearted chat into an absolute car crash that ended with Ricky Gervais being thrown off the show. What you're about to hear is the full story of how Lorraine Kelly's mask slipped, revealing a side of her that shocked the nation and left viewers absolutely stunned. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure you subscribe to this channel for daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals. We bring you the truth that others won't touch. Last night's episode of Lorraine started like any other morning. The studio lights were bright, the coffee was flowing, and Lorraine Kelly sat in her signature spot on the famous orange sofa, ready to greet her guest with that warm Scottish smile she's known for. But within minutes, that smile would vanish completely. Ricky Gervais walked onto the set wearing jeans and a casual black t-shirt, waving to the audience with that cheeky grin of his. He'd been booked to talk about his latest Netflix special and his views on comedy in today's world. The audience clapped as he settled into the sofa across from Lorraine, and for the first minute or so, everything seemed perfectly normal. "So, Ricky, lovely to have you here," Lorraine began, leaning forward with her notes in hand. "You've got a new special out. And I have to say, I watched some of it last night." "Some of it?" Ricky laughed, raising his eyebrows. "Only some? That's not a great review already, is it?" The audience chuckled, and Lorraine gave a polite smile. But there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite right. Something a bit colder than usual. "Well, I watched enough to get the gist," Lorraine continued, and her tone had changed slightly. "And I have to say, Ricky, some of the material you're doing now, it's quite different from your earlier work, isn't it?" Ricky shifted in his seat, still smiling but clearly picking up on the strange energy. "Different how? I mean, I've always pushed boundaries. That's kind of my thing. You know that." "Yes, but there's pushing boundaries, and then there's just being deliberately offensive, isn't there?" Lorraine said. And now her voice had an edge to it that made the studio audience go quiet. Ricky's smile faded a bit. "Offensive to who? I make jokes. That's literally my job. I'm a comedian." "But jokes at whose expense?" Lorraine pressed, and she was leaning forward now, her friendly morning show host persona starting to crack. "Because from what I saw, you're punching down at vulnerable communities, and I'm not sure that's comedy anymore. That's just cruelty." The audience gasped quietly. This wasn't the tone anyone expected from Lorraine Kelly's morning show. This was supposed to be tea and biscuits, not a courtroom interrogation. Ricky sat back, and his expression changed completely. The playful comedian was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely confused and a bit annoyed. Hang on, he said, holding up his hands. "Punching down? What are you on about? I make jokes about everyone, including myself. That's equality. I don't pick on vulnerable people. I make observations about the world we live in. But you must know that some of your jokes hurt people." Lorraine shot back, and now she wasn't even pretending to be friendly anymore. Her Scottish accent was getting sharper, her words coming faster. "You must know that there are communities who feel attacked by what you say." "Feel attacked?" Ricky repeated, and now he was getting irritated too. "Look, Lorraine, with all due respect, feeling attacked and actually being attacked are two very different things. I tell jokes. If someone doesn't find them funny, they don't have to watch. Nobody's forcing them." "That's easy for you to say though, isn't it?" Lorraine snapped, and her voice was rising now. "You're a wealthy white man who can say whatever he wants and face no consequences. But what about the people you're making fun of? What about their voices?" The studio had gone dead silent. Camera operators were glancing at each other nervously. This was not going according to plan. Ricky stared at her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was very calm, but very cold. "I think you've completely misunderstood what I do," he said. "And honestly, I think you've decided to ambush me on your show because you want to look good to a certain crowd. You invited me here to have a conversation, but what you actually wanted was to lecture me on live television." "I am not lecturing you," Lorraine insisted, but her face was flushed now, and she was gripping her notes so tightly that they were crinkling. "I'm asking you legitimate questions that people want answers to." "No, you're not," Ricky said, shaking his head. "You're grandstanding. You're performing for an audience that isn't even here. Look, I get it. Everyone wants to be seen as virtuous nowadays. Everyone wants to be the hero who takes down the big bad comedian. But you know what? I've been doing this for decades. I know the difference between someone who's genuinely concerned and someone who's just trying to score points. Lorraine's face went red. How dare you suggest that I'm not genuine? I have every right to challenge you on the content you put out into the world. Challenge me, fine, Ricky said, his voice getting louder now. But at least be honest about it. Don't invite me onto your show under false pretenses and then try to trap me. That's not journalism, Lorraine. That's just dishonest. The audience was completely frozen. Some people were holding their phones up, recording everything. This was the kind of moment that would be all over social media within minutes. Lorraine stood up suddenly, and her microphone made a sharp scratching sound. I think perhaps this was a mistake, she said, and her voice was shaking with anger. I thought we could have a mature conversation about responsibility in comedy. But clearly, you're not interested in that. Ricky stood up too, and he was taller than Lorraine, which made the confrontation even more intense. No, Lorraine, I'm perfectly happy to have that conversation. But only if it's an actual conversation and not an ambush. You came at me from the very first question. You didn't want to talk about my work. You wanted to attack me for it. I did not attack you, Lorraine said, and now she was pointing her finger at him. I asked you perfectly reasonable questions. Your tone was accusatory from the start, Ricky fired back. Don't pretend it wasn't. Everyone watching can see exactly what you were doing. And that's when things went from bad to worse. Lorraine turned to the camera, bypassing Ricky completely. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this. I tried to have a civilized conversation about important issues, but clearly, some people would rather deflect than engage. Ricky's jaw dropped. Are you serious right now? You're talking to the camera like I'm not even here? Lorraine spun back around to face him, and her expression was pure fury. Because you're not listening. You're so wrapped up in your own ego that you can't even consider that maybe, just maybe, you've crossed a line. What line? Ricky shouted. And yes, he was shouting now. What specific line have I crossed? Give me one example. One actual example of something I've said that was genuinely harmful. Lorraine opened her mouth, then closed it again. She shuffled through her notes frantically, and it was obvious she didn't have a specific example ready. She'd been speaking in generalities the whole time. That's what I thought, Ricky said, and there was a bitter laugh in his voice. You don't actually have anything concrete. You're just repeating talking points you've heard online. Don't you dare patronize me, Lorraine hissed, and her Scottish accent was so thick now that some viewers would later say they needed subtitles. I've been doing this job for longer than you've been famous. Then act like it, Ricky shot back. Act like a professional instead of whatever this is. The producer was frantically gesturing from off camera, trying to get them to calm down or go to a commercial break. But neither Lorraine nor Ricky was paying attention anymore. You think you're so clever, don't you? Lorraine said, and her voice had dropped to something dangerous and quiet. You think you can say whatever you want and hide behind it's just comedy. Well, some of us have standards. Some of us care about the impact our words have. And I don't? Ricky said, spreading his arms wide. Is that what you're saying? Because I make edgy jokes, I must be a bad person with no moral compass? If the shoe fits, Lorraine muttered. But loud enough for the microphones to pick up. The audience gasped again, louder this time. That was a direct insult, broadcast to millions of viewers. Ricky went very still. When he spoke again, his voice was ice cold. Right. Okay. I see how it is. Ricky, I didn't mean... Lorraine started, but he held up a hand to stop her. No. You meant it. You absolutely meant it. You think I'm a bad person. You've decided that because you don't like some jokes I've told, that makes me morally inferior to you. Well, let me tell you something, Lorraine. I have never, not once, pretended to be something I'm not. I tell jokes. Some people love them. Some people hate them. But I'm honest about who I am and what I do. What's that supposed to mean? Lorraine demanded, her hands on her hips. It means that at least I'm authentic, Ricky said. I don't put on a fake nice persona every morning and then reveal my true colors the second someone doesn't toe your line. This whole warm, friendly, everybody's pal act you do, that's the real performance, isn't it? Lorraine's face went from red to white. "Get off my show," she said quietly. "What?" Ricky said, leaning forward. "I didn't quite catch that." "I said get off my show," Lorraine screamed. And the audience actually jumped. "You come here, you insult me, you insult everything I stand for, and then you have the audacity to call me fake? Get out right now." Ricky stood there for a moment, just staring at her. And then he started to laugh. Not a mean laugh, but a genuine, almost disbelieving laugh. "This is unbelievable," he said, shaking his head. "This is absolutely mental. You ambush me, you insult me, and now you're throwing me off for defending myself? I'm throwing you off because you're disrespectful and you refuse to take accountability," Lorraine said. But her voice was wavering now. She knew how bad this looked. She had to know. "Accountability for what?" Ricky shouted, throwing his hands up. "You still haven't told me what I'm supposed to be accountable for. You're just angry because I didn't roll over and let you lecture me." The producer was on set now, trying to physically get between them. But Ricky stepped back. "Don't worry, I'm leaving," he said, unclipping his microphone. "I wouldn't stay on this joke of a show for another second anyway." "It's not a joke," Lorraine said, and there were actual tears in her eyes now. Whether from anger or frustration or embarrassment, nobody could tell. "It's a serious program that tries to address serious issues. By ambushing guests and screaming at them?" Ricky said, tossing his microphone onto the sofa. "Yeah, that's real serious journalism, Lorraine. Well done. You should be proud." "I am proud," Lorraine said, but her voice cracked. "I'm proud that I stood up for what I believe in." "You stood up for nothing," Ricky said, heading toward the exit. "You just wanted a viral moment. And congratulations, you got one. Hope it was worth it." "You're running away," Lorraine called after him. "That's what bullies do when they're confronted." Ricky stopped and turned around one last time. The audience was dead, silent, barely breathing. "I'm not running away, Lorraine," he said. And his voice was very quiet, but everyone heard it. "I'm walking away from someone who invited me here in bad faith, attacked me from the very first question, refused to have an honest conversation, and then kicked me off when I didn't play along. That's not me running. That's me refusing to be part of your circus." And with that, he turned and walked off the set. Lorraine stood there, shaking, staring at the spot where Ricky had been. The producer was trying to talk to her, but she wasn't responding. She just kept staring. We're going to take a break," she finally said to the camera, and her voice sounded broken. "We'll be right back." But as the cameras cut away and the studio lights dimmed for the commercial break, everyone knew that something had just happened that couldn't be taken back. Lorraine Kelly, the queen of morning television, the woman who had built her career on being warm and welcoming, had just revealed a completely different side of herself. And it had been captured live for millions to see. The crew stood around awkwardly, not knowing what to say. Lorraine sat back down on the sofa, her head in her hands. Someone brought her a glass of water, but she didn't touch it. In the hallway backstage, Ricky Gervais was already on his phone, probably calling his agent or his publicist. He walked past camera operators and makeup artists, all of whom were staring at him with wide eyes. "That was insane," one of them whispered to another. "Did that really just happen?" someone else said. Back in the studio, the commercial break was ending, and Lorraine had to pull herself together enough to continue the show. But everyone could see that she was rattled. Her hands were shaking as she picked up her notes, and when the cameras came back on, her smile was the most forced thing anyone had ever seen. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "that was unexpected. I apologize to viewers who were upset by what just happened. I stand by my questions. But perhaps the way things escalated was unfortunate." It was the closest she would come to an apology, and even that was half-hearted. The rest of the show was a disaster. The next guest, some author promoting a cookbook, sat there looking absolutely terrified the entire time. Lorraine tried to bounce back to her normal, cheerful self, but it was like watching someone try to put a mask back on after everyone had already seen what was underneath. Social media, of course, exploded immediately. Within minutes of Ricky walking off, the hashtag was trending worldwide. Clips of the confrontation were being shared millions of times. People were taking sides, with some defending Lorraine for standing up for vulnerable communities, and others absolutely destroying her for what they saw as a calculated ambush of a guest. But the overwhelming response was shock. Shock at how quickly Lorraine had turned nasty, shock at how personal the attack had become, and shock at how unprofessionally she'd handled the whole situation. This was Lorraine Kelly, for God's sake. She'd been the safe, comfortable face of morning television for decades, and in one disastrous interview, she'd burned that reputation to the ground. Comedy fans were particularly brutal in their assessments. They pointed out that Lorraine had provided no specific examples of offensive material, that she'd argued in vague generalities, and that she'd lost her temper when challenged. Meanwhile, Ricky had remained relatively calm throughout most of the confrontation, only raising his voice when Lorraine had essentially called him a bad person. Some media analysts would later point out that this seemed like a planned attack that went wrong. Lorraine had clearly wanted to have a gotcha moment with Ricky, to position herself as the moral voice challenging the controversial comedian, but she'd underestimated him. She'd expected him to either back down or to lose his temper completely, making himself look bad. Instead, he'd called out her tactics, refused to play along, and ultimately forced her to be the one who lost control. And that final moment, when she'd literally screamed at him to get off her show, that was the clip that would define this disaster. That was the moment that showed everyone watching that the warm, friendly Lorraine Kelly they thought they knew was, at least partly, an act. Several regular viewers of the show called in during the remaining broadcast, and while the producers tried to screen the calls carefully, a few got through that were clearly critical of Lorraine's behavior. "I've watched this show for 15 years, one elderly woman said on air, and I've never seen you act like that, Lorraine. I was quite shocked, to be honest." Lorraine's smile was so tight, it looked painful. "Well, sometimes we have to stand up for what we believe in, even if it's uncomfortable." "But you didn't let him explain himself," the caller continued. "You just attacked him from the start." "I think we have different interpretations of what happened," Lorraine said, and then she quickly moved on to the next call. It didn't get better. The next caller was even more direct. "You ambushed that man," the caller said flatly. "You invited him on your show just to have a go at him. That's not right." "I asked him legitimate questions," Lorraine insisted. But her voice was defensive now. "You accused him of being cruel and punching down before he'd barely sat down," the caller said. "How is that a legitimate question? That's just an attack." The producer cut the call off there, and they went to another commercial break. During that break, according to staff members who were there, Lorraine had what could only be described as a meltdown. She threw her notes across the studio, yelled at her producer about the screening process for calls, and demanded to know why nobody had prepared her better for dealing with Ricky. "You said he'd be easy," she reportedly shouted. "You said he'd just laugh it off." The problem was, they'd all underestimated Ricky Gervais. They'd thought of him as just a comedian, someone who wouldn't push back too hard against serious accusations. They'd forgotten that he'd been dealing with controversy and criticism for his entire career. He knew how to handle confrontation, and he knew how to spot a setup. Lorraine, on the other hand, had spent decades in the safe space of morning television, where guests were usually promoting something and happy to play along with whatever narrative the show wanted. She wasn't prepared for someone to actually challenge her, to call out her tactics, to refuse to accept her premise. And so she'd lost it, completely. The show finally ended, and staff reported that Lorraine left the studio immediately without talking to anyone. She got into her car and drove off, while crew members were still packing up equipment. Meanwhile, Ricky Gervais had already tweeted about the incident, in typical Ricky fashion. "Well, that was fun," his tweet read, with a laughing emoji. "Note to self: when someone invites you on their show to chat, make sure they actually want to chat, and not just ambush you for clicks. Live and learn." The tweet got millions of interactions within hours. But perhaps the most damaging thing for Lorraine wasn't the immediate social media reaction or even the terrible press coverage that would follow. It was the fact that this incident revealed something that couldn't be unrevealed. People had seen her lose control, seen her be nasty and accusatory, seen her scream at a guest to get off her show, and once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. Every time Lorraine smiled warmly at a guest after this incident, viewers would wonder if it was real. Every time she laughed at someone's jokes, people would question if she actually found them funny or if she was just performing. The mask had slipped, and everyone had seen what was underneath. That's the real tragedy of what happened. It wasn't just a bad interview or a moment of lost temper. It was the destruction of a carefully crafted persona that had taken decades to build. Lorraine Kelly had made her career on being the nice one, the safe one, the one who made everyone feel comfortable. And in less than an hour of live television, she'd shown that maybe, just maybe, that wasn't who she really was at all. As Ricky Gervais walked out of that building, past the security guards and out into the London morning, he must have known that he'd just been part of something that would be talked about for years. Not because of anything particularly clever he'd said or done, but because he'd simply refused to play along with what was clearly a setup. He'd called out the game while it was being played, and that had forced Lorraine to either admit what she was doing or double down on her attack. She'd chosen to double down, and it had destroyed her. The studio audience had filed out in shocked silence, many of them checking their phones to see if what they'd just witnessed was already online. It was. Clips were everywhere. Within 6 hours, it would be the top trending topic not just in the UK but globally. Did you see Lorraine Kelly absolutely lose it at Ricky Gervais? People were asking each other in offices, in pubs, in group chats, everywhere. I can't believe she screamed at him like that on live TV, others were saying. And the most common response, I had no idea she was like that. I always thought she was so nice. That was the real damage. Not just that she'd had a bad moment, but that she'd revealed something fundamental about herself that contradicted everything her public image was built on. As the day went on and more people watched the clips, the response became increasingly critical of Lorraine. Even people who didn't particularly like Ricky Gervais or his comedy were saying things like, but that was clearly an ambush. And she didn't let him speak at all. And why did she invite him on if she was just going to attack him? The answer, of course, was that she'd wanted a viral moment. She'd wanted to be seen taking down a controversial figure to position herself on the right side of the cultural conversation. But she'd miscalculated badly. She'd forgotten that television is a two-way street and that guests can push back. And Ricky Gervais, of all people, was never going to just sit there and take it. So, in the end, instead of a triumphant moment where Lorraine Kelly showed she could tackle difficult topics and hold controversial figures accountable, the world got something very different. They got a primetime meltdown, a professional disaster, and the unmasking of someone who'd spent 30 years convincing everyone she was something she apparently wasn't. Ricky walked down the street, his hands in his pockets, and despite everything that had just happened, despite being screamed at on live television and thrown off a show, he had a slight smile on his face. Because in the end, he'd been honest. He'd said what he thought, defended his work, and refused to pretend that what was happening wasn't happening. And sometimes, in a world full of performance and pretense, that's all you can do. Just be honest, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it gets you kicked off a show, even when it makes people angry. Because the alternative, as Lorraine Kelly had just demonstrated to millions of viewers, is far worse. The alternative is building your entire career on a lie, and then having that lie exposed for everyone to see.